And welcome back to Frankly Speaking, in conjunction with Mahi Rain. Joining me on the line tonight is my partner, my co-host, my wingman tonight, Julien DeMarco. And on the line, a very special guest calling all the way from Austria, historian Charles Coulombe. How are you doing, Mr. Coulombe?
Very historically minded today. I
All right.
feel, back when 9/11 hit, well, before 9/11 hit, when the Soviet Union fell, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History.
I remember that.
And I thought, no, pal, no way in God's green earth. Then, some few years later, 9/11 occurred to remind us that history is still with us. And some chick, Maureen Dowd, I think it was, I could be wrong, wrote a column with the title The End of Irony. And my thought was, oh no, honey. No. Irony has not yet begun to fight. So
Oh my goodness. Well,
when history and irony are the two constants of the human condition. So anybody who predicts the end of either doesn't know anything.
well, there you go. So, it's funny, Mr. Columbus, as we were planning this conversation with you today, me and Julien planned this out a couple of weeks ago. Julien asked me, what do you want to talk about with Charles Coulombe? I said, well, how about we talk about, sort of the fall of Christendom, the rise of liberalism, all the way up until World War I and World War II. And here we are now. We're waking up this morning and, people are talking about with this incident going on in Russia and the Ukraine that we're possibly at the start of World War III here. Now, I'll be honest, Mr. Coulombe, I'm a little bit ignorant about the history about Ukraine and Russia and their border disputes. The one thing I do know from what some social commentators have said is what Russia is trying to protect in this sort of kind of political atmosphere is that flat strait in that region there where Hitler invaded Russia because it is a point of a clear path of invasion. They say Putin fears that American tanks and NATO tanks get right through and into Russia right there. Completely geopolitics is what Putin is trying to protect. That's the narrative I'm hearing. Of course, on our Western media, well, Putin is the equivalent of Hitler apparently now. I don't know who to believe. Do you have any thoughts on the current affairs that broke out this morning?
Yeah, I'll say. Firstly, as to who to believe, I'd say nobody and everybody. In the sense that it's not as though everyone's telling the entire truth, and it's not as though they're all completely lying either. Russia certainly has been invaded 3 times in the past 150 years from the West. Russia also has a history of dealing very heavy-handedly, shall we say, with its subject peoples. Much less so under the czars, although bad enough sometimes, than under the communists. But of course, it's the Soviets who are most in the immediate memory of Ukrainians, the Baltic states, the Poles, and the former Soviet bloc. Now, the other thing you've got to bear in mind is that since the fall of the Soviet Union, and especially since Putin coming to power, while on the one hand, Putin has been doing his best to resurrect Russia as a great power, during that same period, the West has undergone not just a transformation, but an acceleration of what was already there. I mean, if you think back to 1991 and the abolition of the Soviet Union, we didn't have gay marriage. We didn't have wokery all over the place. We didn't have any of this drivel going on that has now become who we are, or at least who our masters are. Now, Putin, for a long time, seized, for want of a better word, the moral high ground. People forget that our current Cold War with Russia did not begin with their seizing Crimea. It didn't begin with Syria. It began in August of 2013, or June of 2013, when his parliament passed what was called the anti-LGBT propaganda law. And that was when President Obama first began rattling the sabers. So ever since then, rightly or wrongly, and probably sometimes one, sometimes the other. Putin is claimed to be the defender of Christianity and Christian values against both Islam and Western decadence. We, of course, have shown him what's what by being as decadent as possible. And I assure you that one way to defeat your opponent's propaganda is not living down to it. That's probably not smart. If I accuse you of being a thief, your reprisal to me should not be stealing everything in sight. Don't do that. Not if you want to win the propaganda war. Now, the problem with that then is that for a lot of conservative-minded people, they are, shall we say, a lot friendlier toward Putin than they would be otherwise. That's one thing to bear in mind. How sincere Putin is, who knows? I don't. I can tell you that the more he meant his rhetoric in the past, well, the likelier his chances for future success. The other problem we have is at the same time that the West has been undergoing this transformation into wokery, the rulership in the West, the United States, Paris, London, Germany, etc., have been attacking the very elements of their societies which they will depend upon to defend them in time of crisis. The deplorables are the people that go into the combat arms of the armed forces. That's just not very smart. And the height of stupidity came during the hot summer of burning love in 2021. Businesses are burning around the country, thousands of them. And apart from the media calling these mostly peaceful demonstrations, you had civic governments, quote unquote, defunding the police. And then not understanding when the crime rates went way up. I don't get it. I don't understand. So you basically have a Western rulership class that's stupid and insane and evil all at the same time. And I mean this very clinically. I don't mean it as hyperbole. Evil in the sense that we have no problem with infanticide or perversion or anything like that. We're fine with that. Okay. Insane in the idea that the vision in our heads is more important even than our own self-interest. So our masters would rather see women in combat than win battles. Let's lower the standards of the SEALs so that women can participate. Well, that shows the basic insanity. And then the third is, as I say, a basic stupidity. Against that, a man like Putin, who knows what he wants and is very determined to get it, how restrained is he going to feel? What kind of a threat do you think he sees the Western leadership as being? Now, he may very well have miscalculated because, as those who have opposed vaccinations and all that can attest, our rulership can get very nasty when they're upset. They stamp their feet, they purse their lips. What that will translate into as real opposition, who's to say? There are a lot of wild cards. How tough is the Ukrainian opposition going to be? I can't tell. I'm all sorts of people are sending me videos from what's going on over right now, and you've got people using surface-to-air missiles and all this. How much is real? How much is Memorex? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It could be it'll be a quick victory. It could be that Putin is going to find himself bogged down. I will tell you this much: wherever the Russian army is doing well, wherever they're well organized and so on, we'll find out. And where they're inefficient and not doing well, we're going to find that out too. This is a big risk for Putin because any strengths he has, we'll see. Any shortcomings, we'll see. And a lot depends on the Ukrainians, of course, too. As I say, they may put up a hell of a struggle. They may roll over. Who knows? We'll find out.
But they say, Mr. Coulombe, that in regards to Vladimir Putin, that his Christianity is just, I guess, he's KGB. It's a show for him to consolidate his power in Russia. It's all fake,
which
according to many
may
on the political right.
which may or may not be true. I don't know. I can tell you that if it's true or if it isn't, that will determine to a great degree what happens. I mean, if he really is the unreconstructed KGB man, things will go one way. If he's not, they may go another. Again, I'm not going to claim knowledge I don't have.
Yeah.
There are so many ifs, and as is the case, despite what you've heard, I can't really foretell the future. So I'm afraid we're going to have to see how it works out. And one of the important things to bear in mind, and I can't say it often enough, this is the historic background against which you and I have to work out our salvation. You know, my grandparents went through World War One. My parents went through World War Two. All of our ancestors did. And terrible things happened. People died. People saw awful things. People listening to me, as a result of what's going on today, people listening to us now may very well in the next months and years see horrific sights, people ripped to shreds, and have to live with that. That's what really happens in war. I think part of the problem we've got right now is that, with the possible exception of Putin, I don't know if he spent any time in Afghanistan, but very few modern political leaders have ever been subjected to war in the major countries. And a big problem too is the nature of modern war, which allows people to sit at computer desks and never see the carnage they cause. So there's an awful lot of stuff at play here. I would simply suggest two things. One, to remember that the realities don't change, even if we have a war. Heaven is still the goal, because we're all going to die, no matter what happens. Nobody gets out of here alive. Even the people that went through World War One without a scratch, or were never near the front, or were living in Switzerland, they're all dead. Poof, all gone. The second thing I would suggest very strongly is that if you're Catholic, you pray to Blessed Emperor Karl. If you're Orthodox, you pray to their Saint Tsar Nicholas II for peace, because both those men saw better than anybody now living what war brings. It's not pleasant. It's not fun. It's not glorious. Sometimes it has to be done. Sometimes you don't have a choice. But never, ever, ever think it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. All righty. All right. Well, then we'll get on with our conversation, what we have planned, and keeping this conflict in mind, because you brought up something interesting, Mr. Coulombe, how your grandparents were born during World War One, your parents during World War Two. So were my parents and my grandparents. And in fact, I had that scheduled for this show today. But let's start here, okay? And I think I want to start and try to give our audience a picture of history and how, you know, the sort of the age of enlightenment and the fall of Christendom, and try to relate it to some of the historical problems we have today, the political problems that we have today. And I think it starts, of course, with, in many respects, the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment. And many have always said that, you know, the Enlightenment was a byproduct of the age of reason, and that mankind found his intellectual capabilities of sorts, and we were able to usher aside these old stereotypes of religion of the old world. But you know, Mr. Coulombe, when I read history, I don't see necessarily an age of reason that really pops up in that era. What I see is, like we're seeing today, a great loss of faith, of true faith in the world. Is that a fair statement?
It's quite fair. And what helped to bring it about, I mean, notice that the first great quote unquote thinkers of the Enlightenment actually came out of Germany. Now you might ask, why is that? Well, the reason is that the Reformation, of course, came out of Germany, and Germany was the site of the worst product of the so-called Reformation, which was the utterly horrific 30 Years' War. Now, of course, there were civil wars in France, there were civil wars in England that were also very bloody, but none of them compared in horror to the 30 Years' War. So what happens? You've got all this bloodshed, all this horror over issues of belief, and in response arise a group of intellectuals, I use the word lightly, for whom obviously it's belief itself that was the problem. Not which belief, but belief. You often, from that day to this, you've heard people speak of how terrible it is, the very idea of all these people who've died in the name of religion, wars fought in the name of God, and so forth. That motif originated because of the 30 Years' War, etc. And that was why you got people like John Locke, why you got people like Goethe and Kant, because they had seen the results and they drew erroneous conclusions. I mean, if I were to use the same reasoning, I would have to say that far more people have died in the name of freedom and liberty than ever died in the name of God. So if I were to use that reasoning, I would have to say that freedom and liberty must be evil things since so many people have died for them. I mean, if you look at sheer body count, remember that in the 20th century, which was easily the bloodiest century, virtually everybody who died on either side in any conflict, to include the Holocaust victims, all died in the name of freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody, the communists in their various wars were fighting for freedom, and so were their opponents. Everybody was fighting for freedom. Everybody died in the name of freedom. So obviously, if I were to take the rationale that created the Enlightenment, I would have to say that freedom is evil. And it's certainly not something you want to fight for because so many people have died for it. And yet, people will take that reasoning when it comes to faith. At any rate, you're quite right. From that, from the so-called Age of Reason, which was, as I say, a gut-level response to the religious wars, from that emerged the French Revolution, which in itself, and you know, any erroneous idea taken to its furthest possible conclusion will snap back at itself. And that, ideologically speaking, is what you had with the French Revolution. There were other things that played into it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things you always got to be on the lookout against is the idea that only one factor caused any single historical event. That's not true. What is true is that every historical event is a perfect storm of different things, some connected, some not. They come together, and if any one of them hadn't, the outcome would have been different.
Yeah.
But they come together the way they do, and so you get what you get.
That's right.
Liberalism, then, with the ideals of the French Revolution applied by peaceful means.
Yeah. Julien, you with us, buddy? Did we lose you there? I think we lost Julien there, Mr. Coulombe. Well, let me ask you this then. Let's take this a step further.
Can you hear me?
There we
there
are.
you are. Hi, Julien.
I don't know what's going on, but my headphones aren't working. I don't know why.
All right. Well, you got a question for Mr. Coulombe?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. You got a
Okay.
question?
Yeah, I don't know why my headphones aren't working.
That's fine.
Sorry about that. Well, what I wanted to ask, so you kind of answered some of what I already was going to ask, but I'll still ask it and see if you could answer the other part. But, you know, prior to this, you know, we've heard for the last 4.5 years, or maybe even 5, that Russia, Putin's evil, and all these other things, and we have nothing to show for it with the election. You know, there was that whole briefcase thing, millions of dollars spent, and nothing came of it. Well, do you think do you think this has anything? Does this have anything to do with that? And does this have anything to do with Hunter Biden and his oil in the Ukraine? Do you think, or is that just one of many aspects? Or this is trying to say, oh well, this is somehow Biden's fault, even though it may or may not, because it's easy to say, well, Biden is an idiot, his son's an idiot, and this is somehow all Biden's fault.
Well, no, the man I would blame isn't Biden; it's Obama. My lunch was just delivered, so everyone can feel good now.
What are we
No
having?
one wants to ruin lunch.
We're having pork loin and potatoes. So there.
Sounds good.
Just because the world's falling apart doesn't mean I'm not going to eat as well as I can while I'm still here.
Indeed.
But at any rate, no. So the thing is that Obama was the one, as I say, who initiated the current Cold War with his attack on the anti-LGBT propaganda legislation that the Russian Parliament passed in 2013. Prior to that time, we were actually getting on fairly well, and I frankly, though, the one I blame the most ultimately for this problem, for the situation we're in, is, believe it or not, President Bush Sr.
Mm.
Now, the reason why I say that is twofold. One, he stood idly by and watched the fighting in between Serbia and Croatia, which could have been ended very, very quickly and wasn't. He vetoed restoration of the monarchies in Bulgaria and Romania, which their peoples wanted at the time, but we wouldn't allow, just as his son would do in Afghanistan, with similarly stupid results. But probably the worst thing he did, and it was brought up at the time, I mean, it's not like this is some idea I've got with 2020 hindsight, and that was when the Soviet Union fell, what we should have done is done a sort of Marshall Plan for Russia and Central Europe. It would have been a lot cheaper than a lot of other things we did, to say nothing of the Forever War. Because had we done that, had we Marshall planned them, to remember there's no verb you can't noun, had we Marshall planned them, no noun you can't verb, I should say, had we given them a sort of Marshall Plan and done our best to resurrect their economies, bolster them, then Russia would be an ally now, as opposed to what it's been ever since the early years of Putin coming in, and particularly since Obama decided that as the paladin of LGBT throughout the world, we had to, had to show our rainbow flag everywhere.
So has Russia always been seen as the enemy because of Fatima and the Russian Revolution and Uncle Joe, or has Russia been the enemy to the West longer than that? Like, why is Russia seen as the boogeyman in Western's mind, be it Catholic or not Catholic?
Well, firstly, they're big. And secondly, it's varied from time to time. In the 18th century, Russia was just a part of the European alliance of powers. In the 7 Years' War, which in America we call the French-Indian War, Russia, Austria, and France were allied against Prussia and Britain. In the 19th century, other than the French invasion of Russia that turned out badly, Russia was also an integral part of the European construct. It's interesting that during the American Civil War, when the Second Civil War, I should say,
Yep.
when Britain and France supported the Confederacy. Russia supported the Union. And Tsar Alexander II sent flotillas to New York Harbor and to San Francisco to show his support for Lincoln. So they have not always been the old enemy. They became that with communism. And mind you, there had been outbreaks. I mean, there was places of rivalry. The Crimean War, for instance, over Turkey. Things like that, but never anything long-lasting. Britain and Russia had a certain rivalry in Central Asia, the so-called Great Game. And there were a few years in the 1880s when that looked like that might end in war, and it didn't. So until the Russian Revolution, Russia was an integral part of the West. Now, mind you, they have their internal issues as well, in that in the course of the 19th century, as opposed to the Westernizers, you have the Slavophiles, who felt that Russia needed to retreat into orthodoxy and so forth. But by and large, they were not the great boogeyman. However, they came very close to world domination under the Soviets. And the distinction between Russian and Soviet, which is easy for someone of my age who grew up around a lot of white Russians who fought communism, is easy to lose as the years went by and those people died off. And now you have a situation where a non-communist Russia is ruled by a product of the KGB, which makes it very difficult to determine what's real and what's Memorex.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Mr. Coulombe, I'd like to ask you this question now. Classical liberal social commentator Dinesh D'Souza, very popular here amongst conservatives in America, I'm sure you know very well, claims that before the founding of the American Republic, that the vast majority of wealth was distributed by the conquest method, and it wasn't until America itself came to be that we began to employ the business model, that wealth is now distributed via contracts and handshakes. Can we say that post-Enlightenment society has civilized the world while Christendom floundered in violence and human rights?
Only if we don't know much. He obviously, that is such a bizarre comment. I hardly know where to begin.
It was in one of his movies. I forgot the name of it. America, Imagine a World Without Her.
I think would be a better world, but that's just me.
Well, see, I hate to say this, but much as historians, such as myself, enjoy playing that game, it's not something we can ever tell. Because the movement of history is predicated upon so many different elements. One of my little jokes to a Hungarian friend of mine was that if any of the causes I believe in historically had triumphed, I would never have been born. And his response was, "You would never have been born, but you wouldn't have been needed." So I said, well, okay. But as far as his, I don't know where he gets that. I really don't.
Yeah.
It's jaw-dropping.
Okay.
Charlemagne was actually a Chinese transvestite named Tracy. Okay, great. You heard it here first, folks.
Frank, do you know, is Dinesh, is he Protestant of some sort? And what's his background? He just came out of, for me, in the public conscience, he came out of nowhere, sort of like when Ben Shapiro, for me, blew up in the public consciousness.
Yeah, he's a Protestant. I follow him. I used to follow, when I was in a classical liberal camp on the political right here, I used to follow him a lot, watch all of his movies, buy all of his books. And so he's in the Protestant camp. He's also out there, a real big defender of Martin Luther and sola fide, which explains, I think, a lot of what he believes. I don't want to get too much into his personal life because I don't know a whole lot of it, but I believe there may be some certain questions of morality there. But But he is, in fact, a Protestant, and he comes at it from that angle. So
He seems like
he comes from an Indian Catholic family.
that's what it is. Yes.
I don't know if he's a personal apostate or not. But of course, if he is an apostate, then he'd need every reason possible to justify his views.
I've heard Catholic commentators say that he is an apostate. So I'm assuming he probably does come from a Catholic family and lost the faith at some point and embraced the principles, of course, of Enlightenment and Americanism, everything that we have, along with Protestantism.
No.
So speaking of Americanism, do you think Americanism and liberalism? You answered this, I think, in one of your podcasts, but if you could just reiterate, do you think Americanism and liberalism gives us wokery? And in terms of like the patrilineal descent, if the Reformation is the granddaddy and the Enlightenment is the child and liberalism is the grandchild, would wokery be the great-grandchild?
Yes. To answer your question, the statement part of the question, my response is yes. In terms of wokery being a descendant of Americanism and liberalism, absolutely, because the relationship between wokery and so-called American exceptionalism is very much that of Unitarianism and Calvinism. In other words, it's the flip side. So with Calvinism, you have this very doctrinaire, very rigorous kind of belief that was just, this is what it is. If you don't like it, eat it. Unitarianism, which always and only arises in Calvinist areas, the way it did in Transylvania and Hungary, in the Netherlands, and in the British Isles in America. It always comes out of Calvinist roots. Well, similarly, wokery is American exceptionalism turned on its head. So instead of the United States being the best, most wonderful country that ever existed, it's the worst and most horrible.
Yeah.
It, instead of being the Messiah of nations, it's the Antichrist. The idea that it's simply the country where you and I were born, our homeland, we should be ready to die for it. That's certainly true. But I mean, the fact that it's either the last best hope of mankind or Sauron's Tower of Barad-dûr, no. And I mean, it doesn't need to be either one. All it needs to be is our country. I mean, my father didn't have to be either St. Francis or Adolf Hitler. All he had to be was my dad. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, what developed in our country, and I've heard this so many times, America is not an idea, not a country, it's an idea.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Yeah.
Well, the problem with that is that if you lose faith in the idea, guess what? If your notion is that America is all about how anybody from anywhere can come here and grow up and become president, and then you find out, that's not really true. Well, then it's evil. Well, no. It's like every other country that has ever existed or ever will. It's an area with a unique history, some good, some bad, that produced a set of peoples who are us, and loving whom and bringing to the faith of whom is for every Catholic a patriotic duty. Ooh, that was interesting.
That's me.
So how does I guess liberal Christianity, be it liberal Christianity from an American standpoint or liberal Christianity being from the old world, how does that play into the wokery of today historically? Does it aid? Does it not aid? Well, like what is liberal Christianity's I guess relationship to the religion that is wokery today?
The relationship of the masochist to the fellow with the whip. They are completely. I mean, you go to any of the websites of the Episcopal Church, United Church of Christ, whoever you like, and it just flows with wokery.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about how evil our ancestors were. To which my response is, "That's great. Give me your money." The only real compensation there could be for you is to turn over your funding to me. I mean, and it's the same, not just with their churches, but with all the WASP institutions. The Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, all of our learned institutions, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, all going on about how terrible their founders were. The American Museum of Natural History in New York, to which again I can only respond, great. A, either quit your job and get a real job somewhere because you're working for something tainted, or dissolve the corporation and distribute the money amongst the descendants of those you consider to have been oppressed. In other words, if you're going to say that Harvard College is engaging in dialogue concerning our part in slavery, a better thing to do would be to cash in all your endowments, sell everything, and then divide the money amongst the descendants of black slaves in America. That's the only way you can really, if that's how you feel, that's the only way you could possibly expunge the guilt. Unfortunately, they'll have the best of both worlds. They'll keep the money, they'll keep the endowment, they'll keep the power, and whine at the rest of us.
Yeah. Okay.
Charles, one last thing I wanted to ask you. You might be a little bit more versed on this, being Catholic longer than I have been, but why is it that the Catholic Church in America has not necessarily made a great inroads with the black population and converting them and bringing them to the faith?
Well, firstly, for the same reason they haven't made a great inroad with the white population and converting them and bringing them into the fold. I really hate to escape the racial issue, but all right. First, let me clue you in on something. Blacks are like whites in this sense. They both have souls. No, I know, it's true. And those souls will go for eternity to either heaven or hell. Or they won't. Some people don't believe that. Some people believe all kinds of other things. If you're a Catholic, however, you believe that because of the fall of man, in Adam's fall we sinned all. The sin of our first parents put us on that hell-bound train. Now, Christ died and established the church and sacraments to allow us an escape from that terrible fate. And that is why it has been incumbent on Catholics from the time of the apostles down even to the present to evangelize. But in America, in the early days of the Republic, our Catholic forefathers, particularly their leadership, made a kind of deal with the devil. In return for respectability, we would not really try to proselytize. And oddly enough, that deal was consummated the very day I was born. When John F. Kennedy was elected president, we finally got what we wanted, one of our own in the White House.
Yeah.
But in terms of sustained evangelization of the American people, forget it. Oh, and by the way, black Americans, yeah, Americans. That is the reason, just as you'll notice that Catholics have tended to be ethnic. So are black Catholics. They tend to have roots either in colonial Maryland or colonial Louisiana, i.e. either the French or the English Catholics. If they were connected with the Protestant mainstream, then Protestant they stayed. It's interesting to note in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, while the Bureau of Indian Affairs was trying to get Catholic Indians to become Protestant. The Freedmen's Bureau was trying to get Black Catholics to become Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the biggest results of this, I can't think of his name right now, but the man who was the father of Pentecostalism at the famous Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah.
He was baptized Catholic in Franklin, Louisiana. Shortly after which, he and his parents were brought into the Baptist faith by the Freedmen's Bureau. That's a bit of wonderful history for you.
There you go. Can it be said that American slavery, first 100 years of the existence of this country, can there be a case be made that it could have been a byproduct of Protestantism?
Well, certainly in the way that it was. I mean, obviously, Catholic countries had slavery.
Yes, true.
But they were done a bit differently. So, for instance, in Louisiana, because the Code Noir, the Black Code as it was called, required that if you fathered a child on a slave woman, not only did you have to acknowledge them as your own, you had to provide for them as though they were your legitimate children. The result of that was the origination of what we call the gens de couleur libre, the free gentlemen of color, who very often plantations and slaves of their own, educations in France and all the rest of it, and who not only had something of a leadership role in Louisiana early on, their descendants are still powerful in the state today. They know who they are. I'm not going to mention anything about the Autocrat Club, but just saying. Anyhow, well, it just slipped out of my mouth. I didn't mean it. But there, from the time Louisiana became American, their role was considerably diminished, and up until the Civil War, was being chipped away at legally, constantly. All right. Then what happens? Well, with slavery as it had been in the English colonies, and it was in the most of the United States, you fathered a child on a slave, you could get a better price for it. And the relationship was rather different, to say the least. That having been said, in the last 30 years of slavery's existence in America, there was something of a change in the institution. Now, I'm not quite clear as to what it was, but culminating in 1831 with the Nat Turner Revolt, which was a really horrific slave revolt in Virginia, it had been pretty bad, pretty tough in a lot of places, hence the Nat Turner Revolt. But when the war between the states came about, there was not a single slave revolt. And there's an interesting tie-in that people forget, and it's worth thinking about. The vast majority of the white male population of the South went off to fight in the war. And those who owned plantations and slaves, a minority, left their homes and their wives and children in the keeping of their slaves. This is something people don't like to talk about because all sorts of questions immediately have to be raised. What, why, how? So we don't talk about it. Yeah. But it's something that's worth thinking about. However, shortly afterwards, what happens? The South are defeated. I always like to say that the second worst thing that happened to the Southerners after being defeated was Abraham Lincoln's assassination, because he was keen on the Union being reunited with as little fuss as possible. That was all he cared about. But with him out of the way, Reconstruction took shape. And Reconstruction is the poisoned apple that has affected this country ever since. It was ended when the Republicans realized they needed white Southern votes. Because you got to understand, during Reconstruction, not only could white Southerners not vote, they couldn't bear witness in court, which left them open to all sorts of mayhem. And in the meantime, the Southern states were ruled by often illiterate blacks manipulated by the famous carpetbaggers, northern arrivals who helped, guided. So that regime comes to an end, but the white Southern leadership, who were pretty much the same people who'd run the place before the war, they made a gentleman's agreement with the federal government, which was they'd get their civil rights back in return for letting the blacks retain theirs. And as long as they continued to dominate the show, about 20 years, they kept the agreement. But then they died off or retired and were replaced by the generation that only remembered Reconstruction. And that is why Jim Crow began, not in 1870, but in 1890.
See,
that was their way of getting revenge. And it's an interesting thing. Woodrow Wilson, who's probably my second, if not most least favorite president of the United States, introduced Jim Crow into D.C., which hadn't had it before. And you think to yourself, why was he such a racist and an annoying fellow? Well, he had a lot of reasons to be an annoying fellow, but his racism came from the fact that he was raised in Virginia during Reconstruction. The poison apple.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Now, that all having been said, Jim Crow did something interesting. It called forth out of the black population of the United States an ingenuity and a resourcefulness that, shall we say, racists would find impossible to believe. A whole network of black-owned institutions and businesses, most of the time done very independently with minimal help from outside sources and self-run. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Green Book, but when after segregation was brought in on trains, blacks didn't really enjoy taking train trips too much for reasons to be obvious. Then along comes the automobile, and any black family that could afford one, which were a minority, but those who could did, they would get cars and avoid the annoyances of public transportation. But now they had a second problem. The second problem was that there were things like sundown towns where blacks couldn't be overnight. And a lot of restaurants and gas stations and so forth wouldn't serve blacks. So what do? You're going to go on a long haul. You want to drive out to LA from Atlanta. What do? Humanity is always filled with resourceful people. And one of these was a Mr. Green, who came up with the idea for a guidebook for black motorists, which would detail all the places where they were welcome all the way across the country. You might ask, well, gee, how did he get his information? Well, Mr. Green worked for the post office, which then is now a very integrated part of the government. He had informants in post offices all over the country. And the Green Book ran from the 1920s until 1965. Amazing example of ingenuity in a terrible situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't know how I got off on that, but
No, that was good.
Well,
I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by how people will make do. Even in wartime, you read about World War I and World War II, and the nightclubs kept functioning, the cabarets, shells are coming in. The show goes on.
Well, speaking of World War I and World War II, let's jump forward a little bit in history here. And I want to ask you a question about fascism. And I'm not a fascist apologist in any kind of way, Mr. Coulombe. But I do find the era between World War I and World War II very interesting. Like you or your family, my father was born in fascist Italy, and all my aunts and uncles on my father's side were born in fascist Italy. My grandparents on my mother's side, born in fascist Italy. And what is interesting, I guess the first question, part one, would be, why did fascism rise in mostly predominant Catholic countries? That's my first question. And I guess part two of the question is, Oftentimes when we talk about the historical narrative of communism, right, we hear these horror stories of Cubans tying rubber tubes together, risk their lives to get to America, or we hear the stories of the East Berliners trying to jump the fence and being shot and killed in the back while they're trying to escape for freedom. We hear the horror stories of communism during the Soviet Union or the Great Leap Forward in China. But here's the other part of my question. Having parents and grandparents raised in fascist Italy, why don't we get the same horror stories out of fascist Catholic nations as we did out of, again, the communist nations, when in a day and age of liberal sentimentalities, it seems as if fascism is even now a greater evil than communism was. And yet, again, from my experience, we don't have the same level of human rights abuses. You don't have the concentration camps in these Catholic nations. Let's set aside Hitler for a moment. I think he's different. I think you brought up earlier, it's Germany. Germany's always been different. I think a lot of people would say, well, a lot of it has to do with Martin Luther, things like that. We could talk about that. But why is it, despite all the horror stories that we hear about fascism, that we don't have the same kind of human rights abuses from those Catholic nations?
Well, first and foremost, remember that there's a basic cultural difference between Protestant nations and Catholic nations as a rule. Right. And I'm wildly generalizing, but in Catholic cultures, there's a lot of personal freedom. And the way people live their lives. Within certain bounds, in most Catholic cultures, you can do whatever you want up to a certain point. And beyond that certain point, somebody will blow your head off. And you know where you could go, and this far and no further.
Yeah.
So they tend to be very nonconformist, and if you'll pardon my saying so, very difficult to govern. Protestants, on the other hand, for, again, a lot of reasons, Protestants tend to be very great compromisers and very conformist. And they're much easier to rule. They're not anarchists at heart. So as a result, in Protestant countries, you can, let's put it this way, there's much more self-policing in a Protestant nation than there is in a Catholic nation. And the interesting thing there is that people regulate themselves very tightly. And so what's interesting too is that when a Catholic of the sort of culture I've said goes into a Protestant country, he doesn't feel any of the restraints in behavior that the Protestants impose on themselves, and nobody's going to shoot him. So he does whatever he wants and gets real crazy. Contrariwise, Protestant goes to a Catholic country, whether it's the Riviera or Mexico or the beach in Sicily, he doesn't feel any of the restraints and he goes crazy. But never so crazy that somebody will blow his head off, because that's beyond. So I mention this because Catholic nations traditionally had governments, particularly when they were monarchies, that on the one hand were very much religiously based. They were authoritarian in the sense that there were very specific areas that policy was determined at the top. But in everything else, it was determined at the bottom. With Protestant nations, it's the other way around. In terms of Italy and why it went fascist, well, the answer is kind of simple. Italy started off with in 1870 with a division between its religion and its political establishment. And that, not unlike Jim Crow in the United States, that was the dagger in the heart of the country that kept it functioning all that well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, add to the horror World War I and then the communists and the spread of communism in Italy. Now you've got a real problem. You have the Catholics, you have the liberals, you have the communists. And the communists are the most militant, literally. Enter Benito Mussolini. Now, you'd had a lot of people who had been fighting for Italy during the war, and a concept of Italy that hadn't really existed before is born. Mussolini is a left-winger. He's a socialist. He breaks with his party over entrance into World War I, which he's in favor of. The Socialist Party is neutral. And having fought in the war, he becomes a hero among the veterans. And he says, you know, Italy is chaotic. It's anarchistic. We need to pull it all together. Well, and we need to save the country from communism. Meanwhile, the normal politicians of the liberal bent were paralyzed. And so, in 1922, the March on Rome was organized. The prime minister resigns. The king can't find anybody to take the job. And remember, Italy is a constitutional monarchy like Britain. So if you ask yourself, why didn't Victor Emmanuel just take over? Well, I don't know. Why doesn't Queen Elizabeth? That's not how those things work.
Yeah.
You know, his father was such a constitutional monarch that although he was a very devout Catholic, Umberto I, he didn't have the power to end the dispute with the Holy See. And so the Pope developed this weird setup whereby, as Umberto I, King of Italy, he was excommunicated. So there were no high masses or anything for government functions. But he was a very devout person as Umberto di Savoia, and he went to a private low mass every morning. So in his public persona, he was excommunicated, but he was in full communion with the church as a private individual.
Okay.
I mean, that's the extent of the powerlessness of the Italian monarchy.
Yeah.
So Victor Emmanuel III asks Mussolini to form the government. And Mussolini sets to work. He certainly persecuted his political opponents.
Yes.
You stood up to Mussolini. I mean, you say they didn't have concentration camps. Well, they had holding tanks. And they had things like mustard enemas and all that, which were not as much fun as you might think.
Right.
But that having been said, it was to a very small group of people, the most vociferous and violent of his opponents. Now, what was Mussolini's biggest accomplishment? It was keeping Italy out of the Depression. That was the one accomplishment that he could point to unreservedly as his own.
Corporatism. Do we give the credit there? Small sample we have of it, right?
Yeah, and of course, the thing with corporatism, though, and this is something Mussolini understood, corporatism, unlike capitalism, corporatism cannot justify itself. It can only work at the behest of a higher ideology. That's why there's Catholic corporatism. There was fascist corporatism. There were other kinds of corporatism.
Right.
Capitalism will enrich you, and that's all it needs to say.
Right.
Or at least it'll enrich the people who matter. Corporatism will bring justice, but that justice has to be based upon something higher than pure economics. Now, the problem with Mussolini, of course, was that he made a kind of an idol out of the state. And if you really want to know what was wrong with fascism as he did it, and really only his model could be called fascism. Whenever I hear Austrofascism, I want to vomit. But no, if it's not Italian, it's not fascist. I'm sorry, if it's not American, it's not the spirit of '76. No, you don't understand. In Slobovia, we have spirit of '76. No, you don't. Maybe your own revolution in 1976 against the dictator Petar, but that's a whole other story. It's got nothing to do with you. Anyhow, so Mussolini did save Italy from the Depression, and really, from FDR to Winston Churchill, the Western leaders loved him until he broke with the West over Ethiopia.
Yes.
And that breaking with the West has to be understood in terms of his being somewhat misled to think that they would tolerate his invasion of Ethiopia, the Hor-Laval Pact. And the reality, of course, was that the British and the French public would not go for it. And so their politicians, just in order to stay employed, changed their minds very quickly.
Emperor Haile was still on the throne then, right?
Emperor whom?
How do you say his name? Thales or Haile of Ethiopia.
Haile Selassie.
There you go. Not even close. His name probably.
Haile Selassie. We used to say he was Haile Selassie, more so than anyone else. But I'm bummed.
Okay. All right. Okay, Mr. Coulombe, final question tonight here, related again to what's going on in Europe during World War I and World War II. Lots of talk about, of course, the leader of Spain at the time, Franco, stayed us out of World War II.
Yep.
But he's maligned through history as a bad guy who murdered a bunch of innocent people in his country. He's a devout Catholic. He's a military man. Franco, is he a good guy or is he a bad guy?
Also, I think I want to tag on to that question. Do you think part of the reason why he's maligned so much is because the church increasingly became progressive towards the end of his life? Because there was a very cordial relationship with the church, and the church loved Franco at the beginning. But then again, at the beginning of Franco's rule, the church was wildly different.
Yeah, that's true. I think that hating Franco became as much a leitmotif for the new clergy in Spain as hating the Latin Mass.
Interesting.
It was the same era. And the thing you've got to bear in mind, too, that if Franco had not done what he did, Spain would have been another Romania or Poland, only early.
Yeah.
And you would have had Stalin up to the Pyrenees. There's no question about that. And people don't have a problem with that. You know, I like to say, okay, Hitler killed 11 million people. Stalin killed 80 million. How is it we don't feel a greater visceral disgust for Stalin? How come? I don't get it. Mao killed far more than Stalin. But we don't have a problem with that because they were only chinks. You know, who cares, right? If they're not white, they're not real. I know. I understand. I get it. For that matter, we know Mao, number one, he only killed non-whites. Number two, we're making money out of his heirs. So to say Mao was an evil demon would be to reflect badly on us. Uncle Joe was our ally in the Second World War. So we can't really say much against him. Hitler, was our enemy and we defeated him. So we can go on about that.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao were the unholy trinity of the 20th century. And the fact that we only dislike one of them says more about us than it does about any of them.
Okay, but that gets back to the question here, because effectively you have Catholic nations that aligned with Hitler. Does that make those Catholic nations bad?
The same way it makes us Soviets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The same way it makes us responsible for Katyn Forest and for the Gulag Archipelago. Yeah, same way.
So,
every dime in income tax that was ever paid for the Gulag Archipelago. Yeah, sure, whatever.
So would you say if people have a problem with Franco, I've heard this before, and I sometimes say this too, but if you have a problem with Franco, then you shouldn't have, then the Spanish shouldn't have, revolted against the king. If you didn't want Franco, don't revolt against the king and have a civil war, and Franco would have never have come to power. And so, but I mean, people want to seem to have their cake and eat it too. They don't want Franco, and so I guess we'll just get, a Romanian Spain. No. If you don't want any of those types of situations, then don't revolt against King Alfonso. It's to me, it's that simple.
Probably that would be true, but see, people are stupid. you know, there was a very great historian and political writer called Eric von Kuehne-Ledin, whose work I can't recommend highly enough. And he made the comment, and I think it's a true one, that most historians go on about catastrophe versus conspiracy. Everybody agrees that both are present at any given historical event. The question is, how much was conspiracy, how much just happened? But, he said, what they all leave out is the importance of stupidity in human affairs. And you know, he's quite right. So much of what we do as human beings, all of us most of the time, and most of us all the time, is because we're stupid. And stupiditas omnia vincit. Stupidity conquers all. You know, why did I do this and such on this and such an occasion? Well, I have all sorts of justifications, but 3/4 of the time it's because I was stupid. But we don't want to look at that. We'd like to think we would like to think of, if not ourselves, certainly our opponents, as evil rather than stupid.
There you go. All right. Very well said.
You can be both, ladies and gentlemen. I don't want you to think that you have to choose between evil and stupid. You can do both.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Historian Charles Coulombe, author of the book Blessed Charles of Austria, Holy Emperor and His Legacy. You can also find his YouTube show here off the menu every week here. And I want to thank you for joining us, Mr. Coulombe.
Thank you so much. God bless you all. Pray for peace.
Indeed.
Indeed. We sure need in these times, confusing times. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Historian Charles Coulombe. I want to thank my wingman tonight, Julien DeMarco of the May He Reign vlog, who joined me to help me out with this interview. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.